Hello, and welcome back to Fedora Fiction Podcasts, YouTube edition. We are in the midst of my novel, Throwback, Book 1, Aries Triumphant. We're up to Chapter 7, Light at the End of the Tunnel. O'Shea had the transmission for the transport laid out on the workshop floor. The unit had seen some hard use as various parts were so worn as to be non-functional. "This is not a good sign," he said to no one in particular. "This baby went a long time without routine maintenance." He sorted the worn-out parts from those that seemed to be serviceable. "I might be able to cobble together a single-speed transmission with the parts that still work," he mused. "But she won't be very fast." "You could bring the 3D printer online and print new parts," Lima suggested. "Yes, but that would be another draw on our power supply." He squatted on the floor, staring at the parts. "Let me take a look at everything else," he said finally. "I'll make up a list of what is needed, and you can tell me how much it will cost us in terms of our hydrogen fuel." It took another day for O'Shea to get the rest of the unit apart. Fortunately, the motor and hydrogen fuel cell were in good working order. Unfortunately, the bearings, batteries, and suspension were not. "It will take 2 days and 48 hours worth of power to print all those," Lima told him after he input the specs. "And you know, of course, that I can't print a battery array." "I'll adapt one of the backup batteries from the mag field unit." "Forgive me?" "As for the rest of it, do it," he told her. "If the transport breaks down halfway to the surface, it's all over." O'Shea spent the rest of the day inspecting the printer while Lima ran and corrected the code. After checking that he had had a good supply of materials to print from, he had Lima start with the smaller, simpler parts in case he had overlooked something. Once he was satisfied the process was underway, he returned to the habitat through the auxiliary door now attached to the mag field unit and workshop and headed to the kitchen. There, he retrieved the cold slab of protein and carbohydrate mixture from the neutral room and literally choked it down. "You can add flavoring and texturizers to that, you know," Limo pointed out. "Yes, I know. I invented the thing," O'Shea replied crossly. "I don't want to waste the energy." He swallowed a half-liter of cold water with a shiver and headed into the exercise area. There he worked vigorously on the resistance machines and went directly to bed to huddle under a pile of blankets. For the first time that day, he felt completely warm and was able to relax. He fell asleep knowing that he would wake up cold. He did. He got out of bed and repeated last night's routine in reverse order. Exercised, ate a cold breakfast, and went out to the workshop to inspect the 3D printer's night's work. "These look good," he told Lima. "Start on the next batch while I go out and get the solar array off the roof." "As you wish," Lima replied. "Try not to get tossed off. The cargo drone has returned to the landing station." "Good advice," he acknowledged dryly. He didn't want to tell Lima, but he had come to dread these excursions since the accident, as it had driven home just how alone he was. He inspected a new EVA suit before putting it on. "It is really remarkable how well preserved everything is," he said out loud to take his mind off his anxiety. "I'd never guess all this equipment and supplies were 3,000 years old." "They were shielded from cosmic radiation and stored in a vacuum at nearly absolute zero," Lima pointed out. "That's bound to preserve anything." "Anything but tritium," O'Shea replied ruefully as he pulled the suit on and checked the seals. "Let's see. The solar array is about 110 kilos. 112.6 kilos, Lima corrected. "Okay, round up to 113, O'Shea replied. "With Martian gravity about a third of that on Earth. 38%. "Okay," O'Shea said, his patience thinning. "My point is that the array will weigh about the same as 40 kilos on Earth." "Roughly, yes. 42.3 to be exact. So I should be able to lift it off the habitat." "In theory, yes." O'Shea pulled his helmet on and stepped into the airlock. Let's test that theory, he said, picking up the toolkit. Close the door and evacuate the airlock, please, Lima. As you wish. The airlock doors to the outside opened, and O'Shea stepped out to circle the habitat, this time in a counterclockwise direction. He spotted the communications array and looked away from the habitat to the wall of the ice cave, a good 5 meters from the habitat. Apart from some loose pieces of ice, which may have been there already, there was no indication that anything extraordinary had happened. I don't know what I expected, he said sotto voce. The memorial plaque stating Adam O'Shea almost died here. What's that? You asked. You're muttering. Yes, I am, O'Shea agreed unapologetically. Pay it no mind. He turned his attention back to the habitat and continued his search of its walls until he spotted what he was looking for, a series of rungs welded into the sides of the habitat. He slung the toolkit over his shoulder and climbed up the rungs. Once on the roof, he turned away from the communication antenna and walked to the opposite end of the habitat where a rectangular box sat. He found an access panel and, moving with the same careful deliberation as he had days earlier, opened the panel and disconnected the power lines from the array to the habitat. He replaced the panel and set to work with the same meticulous deliberation at removing the bolts attaching the array to the roof of the habitat. He packed his tools away in the toolkit, slung it over his shoulder, and turned to face the folded-up array. 38%, you say? He asked Lima. 37.899% to be exact, came the reply. Well, I'll take that 0.101%, O'Shea said as he bent his knees and wrapped his arms around the unit and lifted. It is lighter than I expected, he grunted, but I wouldn't say that it's light. He walked over to the edge of the roof where the ladder was and set the array down with some relief. He then climbed a few rungs down the ladder and pulled the array toward him. He took another step down and pulled the array over the edge, enough so it tipped toward him. One hand for yourself, he muttered, and one for the array. He took another step down, holding a rung with his right hand and supporting the array with his left. He took another step down with his right leg and eased the array down as he stepped down with his left. He stopped to make sure of his footing and that the array was coming down end first and not trying to pivot on one hand, the one hand supporting it. He took another careful step as before, but his left arm was beginning to fatigue, its muscles to tremble, and the toolkit began to slide off his shoulder. He looked down. He was about a meter from the floor of the ice cave. He took a calculated risk and jumped sideways off the rungs to his right, letting the folded array and toolkit fall. He tried to stick the landing, but lost his balance and slammed backwards on his back, his helmet hitting the ice hard. He was still not completely healed from his last impact, and this one reminded him of that. What happened? Lima demanded. Did you get tossed again? I jumped, O'Shea replied, getting up and looking anxiously at the array, which was lying at the foot of the rung ladder. It looked like you fell, Lima countered. Jumping and falling look a lot alike, he pointed out as he inspected the outside of the array. No dents or dings, he noted aloud. Let's hope the insides fared as well. I'm worried about your insides, Lima retorted. I'm fine, he snapped crossly. How are those parts coming? The last ones will be finished in 3 hours, 23 minutes, and 17 seconds. O'Shea once again slung the toolkit over his shoulder and picked up the solar array with a grunt. Could you please open the mag unit airlock door? I'm going to put this in there. As you wish. O'Shea gratefully deposited the solar array in the airlock of the mag unit and waited for the pressure, if not the temperature, to rise. Once the pressure normalized, he took off his helmet, strode through the mag unit and into the habitat to remove the EVA suit, and set it in its storage unit, which doubled as its recharger. His visible breath tempted him to leave the suit on as it was heated, but that would simply drain his energy supply faster. He opted instead of putting on another layer of clothing. He walked through the kitchen area on his way back to the workshop. Would you like something to eat? Lima asked. Hell no, he replied. Not until I can have something hot. That might not be for several days, Lima pointed out. If ever, O'Shea muttered. I'll force something from the neutral room and down later. Right now, I want to see about adapting a battery for the AT unit. He continued on until he was back in the mag field unit, where he went up to a panel and removed the cover. There he found an array of storage batteries, which, as he expected, looked very similar to the battery from the transport. All right, he said, these should work. He closed the panel and returned to the workshop to survey the parts strewn about the floor. Now to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. He worked for hours meticulously reassembling the transmission, suspension, and bearings. As determined as he was to have the AT unit reassembled before retiring, the cold sapped his energy and concentration. It was when he dropped the same part 3 times due to the numbness in his fingers and his relentless shivering that he decided to call it a night. He shuffled into the kitchen area, utterly spent, too tired to even eat. He drank some water, exercised briefly to warm up, and crawled under the blankets and fell into an exhausted sleep. He was awakened by the cold poking at him through gaps in his blankets. He carefully rearranged them to cut off any drafts, but anxiety over the situation kept him from returning to sleep. After rearrangement of the blankets, he gave up. Up so soon? Lima asked as he worked out on the resistance machines. That was only 4 hours. My medical files tell me that the human body needs at least 8 hours of sleep. Yeah, well, the human body has to be able to sleep, O'Shea replied dryly. And the cold is keeping you awake? I could temporarily raise the temperature. That would still burn through our fuel faster, O'Shea pointed out as he walked into the kitchen area. Besides, it's not just the cold. He steeled himself and swallowed a cold slab of protein and carbs from the Nutrirumen, barely able to repress a gag reflex. I'll be able to sleep once I know that solar array is up and working. That will solve a great many immediate problems, Lima agreed. O'Shea returned to the workshop and found that the part he had dropped 3 times fit easily into place. The remainder of the AT unit also went back together without incident, and O'Shea returned to the power panel of the workshop to retrieve a battery, which did not fit exactly but could be strapped into place once he had determined it was fully charged. The test drive was brief, lasting only as long as it took O'Shea to drive the unit into the airlock. There he loaded 5 kilometers of cable and the solar array onto the cargo bed before returning to the habitat to don an EVA suit. I would take an extra battery, an extra cylinder of oxygen, Lima reminded him, just in case you have to walk back. If you had a tongue, I'd tell you to bite it, O'Shea replied, but that's good advice. He returned to the workshop, retrieved the toolkit, and entered the mag field unit airlock. Okay, Lima, close the inner doors and depressurize. Don't you want to put your helmet on first? Yes, I do, O'Shea said, hastily placing his headgear. Good catch. Depressurizing, Lima informed him from inside the helmet. The outer doors opened, and O'Shea drove the transport around to where the ladder rungs were welded to the side of the habitat. He dismounted and opened one of the spools of cable and pulled a length out. He carried the end to the ladder, stopping only to retrieve his toolkit. He then mounted the ladder to return to the roof and to where the solar array had been mounted. There he connected the cable to the terminals he had disconnected the array from and secured a loop of slack to one of the now unused mounting bolts. He returned down the ladder and pulled out a length of cable before steering the transport away from the habitat and down the tunnel to the surface. It was a painstaking process. He had to pull out a length of cable, drive a short distance, stop, and pull out more cable. On more than one occasion, he overestimated how much cable he had unreeled and stopped to find the spool had fallen off the transport several meters back. He would then have to retrieve the spool, unwinding the cable as he brought it back to the transport. When one spool ran out, he spliced on the end of another spool and continued on. He was making his 3rd splice when he noticed that there was a lot more light in the tunnel. We must be getting close to the surface, he remarked, breaking the silence that had reigned since he had left the habitat. Yes, I would estimate you are less than 2 kilometers from the opening, Lima reported. It is, however, midday, and at this latitude, we only have a few hours of daylight left. I'm going as fast as I can, O'Shea replied peevishly. There was more painstaking movement down the tunnel before O'Shea drove out of the tunnel mouth to behold the darkening sky. He stopped the transport to dismount and scout the area for an appropriate place to install the solar array. What he wanted was a piece of level ground that backed to ice on the north and the horizon on the south. He found such an area a few meters from the tunnel and returned to the transport to spool out more cable. He was on his last spool. He drove to the spot and unloaded the empty spools to be used as footings for the solar array, arranging them on the red dust on the edge of the ice field. Next, he unloaded the array and carefully bolted each of the 4 corners to an empty spool. Finally, he attached the end of the last cable to the power terminal in the array and stepped back. Lima? He asked with a seeking feeling. Yes? The solar array was to use the power from the habitat generator to deploy, wasn't it? Yes, you need to reverse the flow on the cables. But the switch is back at the habitat. Yes. That's an 8-kilometer round trip, 12 counting the last return leg to the habitat. Yes. O'Shea looked at the battery strapped to the AT unit. I'm going to try something. He detached the battery from the transport and lugged it over to the array, disconnected the cable to the habitat, connected the battery, and activated the deployment. He stepped back as the box opened and the broad arms of the solar array unfolded and pointed themselves at the setting sun. He then detached the battery and reattached the cable to the habitat. There is a small flow of electricity from the array, Lima reported. Nicely done. Now you'd better hope there's enough left in that battery to get you back here. I'll walk if I have to, O'Shea replied, lugging the battery back to the AT unit, changing EVA batteries and oxygen bottles. That bit of housekeeping done, he mounted the AT and turned it around to re-enter the tunnel. Something in the distance caught his eye as he did so. A battered skeleton of what was probably a dome similar to his ag unit stood lit by the setting sun. Gonna want to check that out, he mused aloud. Perhaps another day, Lima suggested. You have already used your backup battery and oxygen bottle. And it's getting cold, O'Shea agreed, watching a frost develop on the surface of the AT. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is sublimating. Time to come in, Lima said, and yes, you have to. As it turned out, the battery lasted until the transport was inside of the habitat, the trip back being accomplished in a small fraction of the time taken by the trip out. It was a short walk to the habitat, even carrying the battery, but long enough for O'Shea to hallucinate movement in the shadows of the corner of his eyes, which he put down to extreme fatigue. The electron stream has ceased, Lima reported as he got out of the EVA suit. The sun has set. When will it rise again? O'Shea asked as he walked to the kitchen. In 14 hours, 12 minutes, and 23 seconds, came the reply. Well, I'm going to splurge and have a hot meal, O'Shea announced as he placed a packet in the rehydration unit. You go, boy. O'Shea stopped mid-motion. Excuse me? It's an early 21st century colloquial expression of encouragement, Lima explained. I see, he said after a pause. How long before we can get this place warmed up again? Assuming the best, let's do that. Assuming the best, Lima repeated. All batteries should be recharged and sufficient fuel made by electrolysis of sufficient quantity in 49 hours, 32 minutes, and 17 seconds. From now or of solar collection time, O'Shea removed his meal from the rehydrator and sat down. Solar collection time. What? That's a week. 5.9 days, Lima corrected. 5 more fucking days of living in this refrigerator. O'Shea put his face in his hands. Well, he said finally, sitting up. There's nothing else to be done about it. I'm going to bed. He exercised and crawled under the blankets. It seemed he had just drifted off to sleep when he was awakened by a loud thumping and Lima's insistent call. Dr. O'Shea, wake up! Wake up! There's someone at the door! Okay, well, that ends Chapter 7 of Throwback Book 1, Ares Triumphant. I remind you that all the books published by Fedora Fiction Press are available at amazon.com/author/Tom Goss. I'm Tom Goss. Thanks for listening.